We are just 24 hours away from another week of fantasy football all day on Sunday, and I can't tell you how excited this time of the year makes me. It's one of my most requested videos from you guys, so we need to go through the must start and sit running back options in fantasy football from every single matchup of week 2. I am in a different location today, guys, but there are no excuses. We are getting this video done. And we've even got a bonus part at the end, and I will be picking my favorite underdog flex option at the running back position. And I will be spending all day today answering your fantasy football matchup questions for week 2. So please make sure to go down there and drop a like on this video and subscribe to the channel if you have not already to show the channel support. So we've got a lot to get into today, so we're going to go ahead and just fly right into these right now, guys. So right now, we've got the Ravens and the Bengals up first. And what I'll say about these orders and these rankings right here. So when you see on the start list, the flex territory list, those are going to be in accordance with my rankings in each particular week. So these running back rankings right here, they're going in order of how I ranked them earlier this week. So the only must-start guy to me in this matchup is Joe Mixon. I get it. He was one of the many Bengals who had a bad game on last week. I don't think it's going to continue. The Bengals are going to continuously prove every week that they're still a top offense. They're going to improve, and I think that Joe Mixon is going to have a rebound game, but even from just a volume perspective, Joe Mixon is not a guy that you can just sit on your bench. You can't do that type of behavior when you drafted Joe Mixon in probably the 4th or the 5th round, maybe even the 3rd round of your fantasy football draft. So Joe Mixon is a solid start here. Gus Edwards and Justice Hill both make the flex option list. I said it earlier in the week. I mentioned both of these guys in my waiver wire pickup video, and I said that I believe that based on what I saw in last week's game, Gus Edwards is going to be handling the majority of the volume between the 20s, and Justice Hill is going to get the goal line and the short yardage work. Which Justice Hill, they're basically in the same tier for me, so don't make too much about me having Gus Edwards one spot above Justice Hill. They're basically in the same tier of like middle tier type of flex options. The reason that they're on flex options is because their offensive line is very good and they're on a good offense as a whole. So they definitely had to make this list in this particular matchup right here. Not wild about starting either of these guys though. And then sit everybody else. Nobody else is really relevant, especially Bengals running backs. Nobody else to even look at or sniff around besides Joe Mixon. Moving on to our next matchup, we've got the Seahawks taking on the Lions in Detroit this week. And I've got 2 start running backs in this situation. Kenneth Walker's a no-brainer, and I would play Jahmyr Gibbs as well. Jahmyr Gibbs was sort of closer to the flex territory, but Jahmyr Gibbs, I think, is still a start. I think with Jahmyr Gibbs specifically, we're going to start seeing him getting more touches in this backfield because he's such a talented player. We saw on Thursday night in that week 1 game against Kansas City who clearly was the better running back. We also saw who got the most touches, and that was David Montgomery, and that's why he's a flex option. But Jahmyr Gibbs is no doubt. You do not sit this guy unless he has some sort of injury or there's some major development in this offense and he starts regressing in total volume. And then Kenneth Walker, to me, is a prime type of guy to have a bounce back week. I think the Lions defense is definitely improving, and I do think that they showed that in week 1. But Kenneth Walker, to me, I think this team's going to come out a little bit better. I have plenty of faith in Kenneth Walker because he handles the majority of the volume in this backfield. And like I said, Dave Montgomery is a fine flex option. Most weeks, he's going to be in my upper tier of flex options available. Again, unless something changes and he just rides the pine. But I'll tell you something, he won't. He won't ride the pine because they signed him to a big, expensive contract. Not super expensive, but in running back terms, they're not going to just sit this guy on the bench on an $18 million contract when over half of that value is guaranteed. So everybody else you sit, Zach Charbonnet, I know that there's a lot of people who have him on rosters and they're waiting for maybe some value to show up later. It's not the week for it. Zach Charbonnet barely handled any work last week, and it's hard to tell in a blowout game exactly what the volume is going to be, but I'm not confident in telling my audience to start Zach Charbonnet in this particular week until we see more out of the backfield and more of a workload for Zach Charbonnet. So we've got the Colts at the Texans in our next matchup right here, and we're going to go ahead and start Dameon Pierce. He was right there on the bubble of guys to start or flex. I think Dameon Pierce is going to be a much better option this week than he was in week 1. Had 5 fantasy points in week 1 versus the Ravens. Dude was just simply stifled by the defense. The Colts defense is definitely, I was impressed with what I saw against Jacksonville personally, but it's not exactly the Baltimore Ravens defense as far as just the toughness and the run stopping ability is. Jacksonville ate up Colts on the ground last week. So I like Dameon Pierce this week. I don't love him, but I think he's going to give you better output this particular week. Flex territory, reluctantly saying Zach Moss, because Zach Moss looks like the clear running back one in this backfield now that he is expected to make his return in week 2 fantasy football. So I think that Zach Moss is pretty much in my upper middle tier of flex options this week. The only reason is because the matchup is good here, going up against consistently one of the worst rushing defenses in the league, although I do think they're getting better just as an overall defense personally. But he's also just a volume play as well. Zach Moss should handle the majority of the volume, especially with Deion Jackson's horrific output last week, averaging barely over 1 yard a carry. So Zach Moss is going to be a middle upper tier flex type of guy this week. And then we've got Deion Jackson and Devin Singletary in sit category. Simply just not enough volume or efficiency for these guys to be in consideration to even sniff my starting lineup. Bears at Buccaneers, our next matchup here. Nobody's a must start in this matchup. I don't believe anyone's a must start. I mean, this is what we're dealing with here. Essentially what we're dealing with is teams with 2 bad offensive lines. The Bears are better offensive line-wise than Tampa Bay, but they're not much good as either. And one of these guys may not handle a massive workload, and the other guy is just not efficient doing it. So in flex territory, like, they're pretty upper tier flex options here. That's what I will say. Khalil Herbert, I still have faith in the guy. He led the backfield last week. Roschon Johnson had the better fantasy output, but Khalil Herbert led the backfield in touches, and he was the starter on this offense. In a more competitive game, Khalil Herbert will have more value this week, in my opinion, and that's what I absolutely trust doing and telling you guys to do. Absolutely consider flexing Khalil Herbert in this particular matchup right here. Rachaad White, volume play guy. I think he'll be better this week because he's going up against a much worse defense personally, but I don't think that he's anyone that you can be consistently starting. But for this week, he's in the upper tier of flex guys, in my opinion. So sit guys, I'm going with Roschon Johnson. Don't start Roschon Johnson. The guy, like I said, most of his value was in garbage time this past week. That was his reality. He was not in a situation where he was starting out the game as the clear back. It's not how it worked. I wouldn't start Roschon Johnson this week. Deonta Foreman, same deal. Volume just isn't there. Sean Tucker, I'm interested to see how he inches his way, because I think that he has upside and potential later on, but when we're talking week 2, we're not seeing that yet. Chiefs at Jaguars, the fantasy football matchup of the week this week. I cannot wait for this matchup, by the way. Start Travis Etienne. This is a no-brainer here. I absolutely love Travis Etienne, and those of you who watched my content all offseason know how much I love Travis Etienne. Think this guy is a league-winning player this year. He was excellent week 1. Continue to roll out Travis Etienne with full confidence, 100%. Flex territory, I've got the 2 Chiefs running backs here, the 2 main guys. Pacheco's in the upper tier. Pacheco's in the upper tier here just because of the matchup volatility and because the upside is so high in this particular matchup. But the volume here is not consistent. I mean, last week, Clyde Edwards-Helaire started out this game. So it's not like Isaiah Pacheco was just the lead dog and there was no question about it. That's not how it happened. I do think he's going to be more volume heavy this week, and there will be less of Clyde Edwards-Helaire, but nothing's set in stone with this Kansas City Chiefs offense as a whole, aside from Travis Kelce. But with the matchup here, I just can't say no to the possibility of flexing Isaiah Pacheco in this matchup. Same with Jerick McKinnon. I can totally understand, honestly, every single week, someone wanting to flex Jerick McKinnon. The upside he has as a pass catcher is so there. Now, granted, it wasn't really there in week 1. He had 1 catch, basically, and that was it. Jerick McKinnon did not provide any significant fantasy football value last week. Jerick McKinnon's that kind of guy, though. Totally a boomer bust guy. Very similar to Gabe Davis at the wide receiver position. I can understand people wanting to flex Jerick McKinnon in any matchup, especially in this particular matchup, though. Sit Tank Bigsby. I wrestled with Tank Bigsby being in flex territory. This is just a preference thing here for me personally. I don't think that Tank Bigsby is going to continuously see that amount of volume for the rest of the season. I think it'll be a week-to-week thing that we see Tank Bigsby getting 10 carries, 12 carries, and then getting 5 or 3 carries. It's not going to be consistent, I don't think, because Tank Bigsby wasn't really that efficient carrying the ball. I know he got in the end zone last week. I know that. He was in my flex consideration, ended up electing to tell you guys to sit Tank Bigsby in this matchup right here. Same thing with Clyde Edwards-Helaire. Clyde Edwards-Helaire is a no-brain sit. Packers at Falcons, next matchup here. We've got, obviously, Mr. Bijan Robinson in star territory here. Was super efficient on every single touch he had last week, including a reception touchdown. You don't sit Bijan Robinson, even though he shares the backfield with a guy in flex consideration, Tyler Algier. Tyler Algier is definitely in the upper middle tier of flex options this week. I mean, Tyler Algier, I said this earlier this week. I think this offense is good enough and centered around a run game enough for Tyler Algier to be relevant in fantasy football, just like Bijan Robinson. You've got one superstar, Bijan, but your other guy, he's going to be fantasy relevant at least for the first couple weeks of the season, and I think it's no exception to week 2. Now, this particular situation in Green Bay is obviously a little bit difficult right now. Aaron Jones missed practice all week. I'm filming this on Friday night, and we don't know exactly what's going to happen with Aaron Jones. I've been seeing reports he's leaning towards probably not playing. If he does play, he's absolutely in flex territory. We know what he did last week. Running back 1 on the week, over 25 fantasy points. Dude can break off a play at any time. But if he does not go, A.J. Dillon becomes a guy that you start. That's why A.J. Dillon has an asterisk next to him, because he has a situation where if Aaron Jones doesn't go, I'm putting A.J. Dillon in flex territory because he's on a good offensive line and it's a well-run team and it's a well-run offense. So A.J. Dillon to me, flex territory either way, but if Aaron Jones doesn't go, A.J. Dillon is a start for me. And then you sit everybody else. Don't worry about anybody else. Raiders at Bills is the next matchup here in Buffalo this week. So you go ahead, you obviously start Josh Jacobs. There's no question about that. I know he's coming off the bad week 1 performance. It doesn't matter. The volume's going to be there. Josh Jacobs is a great player. There's going to be a big game or two in the next couple of weeks here for Josh Jacobs. James Cook, I think, is a start this week. I think James Cook is a very, very good start. Last week, I had him in flex territory. This week, James Cook is going to be a very good start, in my opinion. Raiders defense is not even close to being as good as the Jets defense was last week. So this matchup is going to lighten up significantly for James Cook this week. So I'm going to go ahead and say James Cook, feel very comfortable starting him. Flex territory, I've got nobody. It's really those 2 main guys that you start here, and then you sit guys like Damian Harris if you have them. You sit guys like Zamir White if you have them. Those 2 are really just handcuff options as well, insurance policies, so don't worry about starting them week to week unless the other guy goes down. Now moving on to a matchup where you might need to play a backup running back, we've got the Chargers at the Titans here in Tennessee. You obviously start Derrick Henry. To start this out with, Derrick Henry, I know that his volume was a little bit lower than usual last time, and Tyjae Spears was getting a lot of snaps last week. Derrick Henry still has the ability to make off the big play. This offense still does revolve around him. He still is the best player on this offense. So I'm not going to say to sit Derrick Henry any week unless we see something drastically change over the next couple of weeks. Flex territory, you've got Josh Kelly here. If you haven't heard, Austin Eckler is doubtful for Sunday's game in this particular matchup here. So Joshua Kelly, absolutely in flex territory. He looked good last week. He had a good game last week. I'm not wild on it though, because the matchup is tough. Tennessee, as bad as they are against the pass, they're very good against the run. They do not let you run. And I think that's going to pose a problem here for a team that I think will be very pass heavy this particular week. And Josh Kelly simply doesn't have the pass catching upside that a guy like Austin Eckler does. And then you go ahead, you sit Tyjae Spears if you have him. Tyjae Spears, I understand the upside play. And I do think that he might have more value as the season goes on. I just did not see enough from this guy in week 1 on the snaps that he was given. So I'm going to go ahead, sit Tyjae Spears until further notice. 49ers at Rams this week in Los Angeles here. Obviously starts Christian McCaffrey. What else is there to say? Dude's a freaking beast. Dude, it's still got it. He's still fresh as ever. Let's move on. Kyren Williams, flex territory. I really didn't consider putting him in start territory either. This matchup sucks, man. And I get it. Last week was good. Like, last week, obviously, he was one of the prize waiver wire pickups of the week, along with Puka Nacua. But, I mean, this is a matchup here where it's going to be so much tougher than last week, man. Seattle's defense is nowhere near the run defense that San Francisco has. It's just going to be a much, much uglier matchup. And I think that they could even be more efficient than they were last week. Him and Cam Akers combined for like 2 yards per carry in week 1. This backfield is not efficient, and it's because the offensive line is bad, and I just don't think that the upside is really there. I do think from a volume perspective, you could play him though for sure. But honestly, to be clear, Kyren Williams is about in my lower middle tier, closer to low tier flex options in this week. You sit Cam Akers because this guy was not nearly as important to this offense. Kyren Williams was the starter. This game was a blowout, and I know that Cam Akers still had over 20 carries, but the game was well out of hand by the time Cam Akers was seeing significant volume. Elijah Mitchell, you sit him as well. Christian McCaffrey's running this backfield. Giants at Cardinals. This week in this matchup, you start Saquon Barkley. I took Saquon Barkley to have a massive bounce back week this week. He was a top 3 running back in my running back rankings video in this particular week because the matchup is so much better than it was in week 1 versus the Dallas Cowboys. It's such a better matchup, man. Arizona's defense is so much worse than the Dallas Cowboys, and everybody knows that. You never sit Saquon Barkley, but I'm picking him to have a massive week this week. James Conner's in flex territory for me personally, and it's honestly similar to the situation that Kyren Williams is in. He's just on a team that has a bad offensive line, and their offense is worse than the Los Angeles Rams, at least according to last week. But from a volume perspective, I can definitely see wanting to plug James Conner into your lineup in this particular week. That's what I'll say is I think that he's probably a middle tier starter, upper middle tier maybe, because I do think that James Conner obviously is going to get the volume. He's still not a bad player either. He's one of the only functional pieces on this offense. And then sit everybody else. You don't worry about anybody else in this particular matchup. Jets at Cowboys in Dallas this week. You go ahead and you start Mr. Tony Pollard. This guy's going to be a beast in fantasy football this year. You never sit Tony Pollard. I don't care what the matchup is, and this is about as tough a matchup as it gets. You still don't sit Tony Pollard. He's a clear top 5 to 10 running back on any given week in fantasy football in 2023. Flex territory, Breece Hall and Dalvin Cook are both on this list. Breece Hall is in the upper tier, and I wrestled putting him as a start this week. The only reason that Breece Hall is not in start territory is because of the matchup. The matchup is really, really tough, and this offense is also now one-dimensional with Zach Wilson. So this offense is simply not going to have the upside that it did with Aaron Rodgers for the 3 snaps that he gave, right? Like, this is a situation where Breece Hall, the talent is there. I love the player personally. I love him in Dynasty specifically, but Breece Hall in week 1, I think could have some struggles just because of the matchup. He's still an upper tier flex option for me. Dalvin Cook is a fine flex option as well. I think that just from volume perspective, he's going to get volume. I think it's going to be lower this week, and you're going to start to see Dalvin Cook just fall way and way back in my rankings every single week in fantasy football, to the point where he's just kind of almost irrelevant. Not from a football perspective, but from a fantasy football perspective, this guy is definitely a descending asset instead of an ascending asset. You go ahead and you sit everybody else in this matchup. Commanders at the Broncos here in Denver this week. Nobody I am confident telling you guys to start. I will not tell my audience to start either of these running backs. First of all, you've got Brian Robinson in flex territory, who, yes, he had a touchdown last week, saved his fantasy performance because he averaged 3 yards a carry. Brian Robinson is not efficient because the Washington Commanders offensive line is simply not very good. The Washington Commanders offense is simply not very good. So the upside week to week just is not as high. And I've got news for him. This offense is going to see many more difficult opponents that are way worse than the Arizona Cardinals were in week 1 for Brian Robinson. So I'm not going to tell you guys to start Brian Robinson confidently. Of course, from a volume play, you go ahead and you say that you can flex Brian Robinson, but I'm not telling you to start him. And I can't tell you yet to start Javonte Williams with confidence. I'm just not there quite yet with Javonte Williams. I think I need to see more time and more volume come his way. Although he did see 18 opportunities in week 1, which is very encouraging, I need to see a little bit more, and the matchup here is also tough as well. So maybe by next week in week 3, I'll be confidently telling you guys to start Javonte again. You sit Antonio Gibson, volume wasn't there. The playmaking ability wasn't there. Again, against a horrific team, against the Arizona Cardinals, no way I could tell you guys to even consider flexing Antonio Gibson. And also Samaje Perine. I went ahead and put him as a sit, wrestled with him in flex, but again, I think this is going to be a similar situation to Breece Hall and Dalvin Cook, where you have Samaje Perine, who is just going to be a descending asset in fantasy football, and we'll see less and less volume as the weeks continue to go by. Dolphins and Patriots is our next matchup here. You start Ramondre Stevenson because what you saw last week was not an efficient version of Ramondre Stevenson. Last year, he averaged 5 yards per carry. This past week, he averaged barely 2 yards a carry. That's not going to be the norm for Ramondre Stevenson. The dude is a very efficient runner. It was a bad week because he's going up against one of the best front sevens in football versus Philadelphia. Different this week. Dolphins defense is much worse and a much easier matchup here. And also, he gets the pass catching upside. So Ramondre Stevenson honestly is a no-brainer to me this week. And then we've got Raheem Mostert and Ezekiel Elliott in this particular matchup. Raheem Mostert just simply because he's on a fantastic offense and he was the clear lead back this past week. But make it clear, they're very similar to the Buffalo Bills where they don't run the ball that much. In fact, Buffalo runs the ball more than Miami typically does. Like, Miami barely ran the ball at all last week. Raheem Mostert definitely still in flex territory, though, just because of the offense with potential on every single week you're out there. Zeke is a lower-end flex option, but he's a decent option just from a volume perspective if you look at last week. I'm not really going to be looking to start Zeke any week, and this week is no exception, but I do acknowledge that if you are in a situation where you are in a deeper league, right? A lot of you are in deeper leagues. You might need to swing for the fences, and Zeke is not a bad option this week to swing for the fences, just because the matchup here against the Dolphins defense is definitely better than it was last week. You sit Devon Achane, it's not his time yet. He didn't get a single touch in week 1. It's just not going to be there yet for Devon Achane. I need to see more first. Saints and Panthers, the first Monday night game. We've got to start Miles Sanders. He was kind of on the borderline of flex guys just because the offense is bad and the offensive line is bad. But Miles Sanders, clear running back one in this offense. I'm going to continue to trot out Miles Sanders with plenty of confidence in the next coming weeks. Flex territory, Jamal Williams here. Jamal Williams is just a guy who is just in a much worse situation than last year. Much worse offensive line, much worse offense as a whole. It's not the same here, and you saw it last week. Jamal Williams was very inefficient because he's not that great of a running back in real life. Good in certain situations, and I think he's always going to be a touchdown threat because he knows how to get the ball in the end zone. He's got a nose for the end zone. But this is a situation where against the Panthers defense, I think he can be good. And I do think that he's in the upper tier flex options. I'm not saying he's in the same must-start category as Miles Sanders is, though. We've got Kendre Miller and Chuba Hubbard to sit. Kendre Miller may or may not play. He's still questionable coming into the weekend, so we don't know exactly if he's going to play. It doesn't matter to me. Don't play him either way. We don't know what the volume is going to be. We don't know what the workload is going to be, especially coming off an injury. And then also Chuba Hubbard just isn't as relevant enough in this offense. Although he did have about 10 touches last week, not going to see me telling you guys to start Chuba Hubbard this week. Then we've got the Browns at the Steelers in Pittsburgh this week, the second Monday night game. You start Nick Chubb for sure. There's no question about this one. Everybody knows you start Nick Chubb on a weekly basis. And I wrestled with Najee a lot of times today. I wrestled with him a lot over the week, considering putting him in the start category. Ended up doing it because last week was last week, right? They obviously got just embarrassed on their own field by the San Francisco 49ers. But again, this is a tough defense. And the game was so out of hand early that you really couldn't get an accurate feel for how important and how relevant that Najee's going to be in the offense. I'll tell you this, I watched that game live. Najee was the starting running back, and the only time Jaylen Warren was getting touches was when the game was so out of hand and they were trying to get some sort of spark. And he didn't do good either. So it's not like Jaylen Warren was just outperforming Najee last week. No, that wasn't the case here. Najee's going to be the starter. They're going to be more competitive this week. I'm going to go ahead and take a shot on Najee this week. Flex territory, nobody. Like I said, Cleveland Brown running back, not relevant enough. And Jaylen Warren, I'm telling you guys, is just not relevant enough in this offense yet. Future weeks, maybe we'll see that upside. But up to the point of his career, we haven't seen real fantasy upside from Jaylen Warren for me to tell you guys to consider flexing him. So time for my favorite underdog flex option of the week. I'm going with Jerick McKinnon as my favorite underdog flex option of the week. Obviously, like I said earlier, Jerick McKinnon was stifled last week. He didn't do much. He just wasn't involved enough in this offense, right? That wasn't the case last week. It's just such a week-to-week thing for Jerick McKinnon, but the upside here is so stupid high for this to work. And I think that Jerick McKinnon is in a situation where Kansas City is going to get this backfield way more ironed out this week. I mean, Clyde Edwards-Helaire started the game last week. I don't think that's going to happen. I think they're going to turn to Isaiah Pacheco for the carries and go back to what they did at the back half of last year, which was having Jerick McKinnon be super involved in this passing offense. So my underdog flex option of the week is Jerick McKinnon. So let me know what matchup questions you are struggling with before week 2 fantasy football, and I will answer every single comment I can down in the comments below. And if you want to make some trades before week 2 fantasy football and see a list of guys you should sell high on before week 2, click on this video right here.